Ancient Rome has a very rich history when it comes to homosexuality, and you will not believe how the empire changed over time. From basically accepting love between the same gender to creating brutal punishments, here is a run-through of the entire history of homosexuality in the Roman Empire till today. Homosexuality in ancient Rome. The reality of homosexuality in ancient Rome persists, despite the exclusion of sexual acts from historical accounts. That's not nearly as simple as a gay versus straight debate, though. Rather, it's a far more nuanced cultural perspective where the social standing of those engaging in certain activities determined whether or not sexual behavior was acceptable. But did you know, despite how knowledgeable Romans are, there is no certain term that can describe homosexuality during early times. Rather, their nomenclature was determined by the roles that the individuals engaged in. To further know about homosexuality in the Roman Empire, let's start by talking about Rome as a patriarchal system. Rome as a patriarchal society. Rome's prehistoric civilization was incredibly patriarchal. For males, one's ability to exhibit the Roman virtue of virtus determined their level of masculinity. Among the many principles that all freeborn Romans attempted to uphold was this one. Virtus was not just about virtue, it was also about self-control and the capacity to rule oneself and others. To elaborate, discussions of the active role of invasion and empire in ancient Rome frequently used sexual metaphors. Homosexual conduct was seen in terms of dominance as masculinity was based on one's capacity for conquest. An individual who assumed the position of the perceived dominant or penetrative would face far less scrutiny from the public than one who was being penetrated or submissive. In the eyes of the Romans, the act of being conquered suggested a person's weakness and willingness to give up their freedom as a free citizen. It also called into question the entirety of his sexual integrity. As Elizabeth Sitko puts it, bodily autonomy was one of the regulatory norms of sex which helped define one's status within society. An elite Roman male demonstrated his status because he was not allowed to be beaten or penetrated. It's interesting to note that there were no homophobic or heterosexual terms in the Roman language. The social standing of a potential sexual partner was more important than their gender in determining acceptability. Roman censors were a body of authorities who decided where a person's family fit into the social order and sometimes expelled people for sexual misbehavior from the top classes of society. Again, this was done on the basis of position rather than gender. Same-sex partnerships between people with the right social standing were generally accepted and typical. Roman men who were freeborn were allowed to have intercourse with partners of any gender. In fact, it was expected of them. Roman men may have connections with people other than their spouses, even after they were married. He was, hence, supposed to limit his sexual relations to prostitutes, enslaved individuals, or those deemed infamia. This was a lesser social rank given to those whose social and legal standing had been formally eliminated or diminished by the censors. Performers like gladiators and actresses were also part of this troupe. A person who was considered an infames was not allowed to testify in court and would receive physical punishments similar to those meted out to slaves. Expert in ancient history, N.S. Gill makes clear that, instead of today's gender orientation, ancient Roman sexuality can be dichotomized as passive and active. The socially preferred behavior of a male was active, the passive part aligned with the female. Roman men who were free were allowed to engage in sexual relations with slaves, prostitutes, and infames, but only on the condition that they assumed a domineering or penetrating role. It was forbidden for him to have relations with other freeborn Roman men or with their spouses or offspring. Furthermore, he was prohibited from having intercourse with an enslaved person without that person's consent. Going back to the topic of homosexuality, Roman males were involved in gay love relationships, that's for sure, albeit these are not well documented. The majority of academics concur that same-class males have had relationships, but these relationships were kept secret due to the very rigorous social norms that were attached to them. Even though it was against the law, several males are known to have participated in marriage ceremonies in public with other men. Emperors Nero and Elagabalus, for example, are known to have done this at least twice. Furthermore, at one point in his continuous conflict with Mark Antony, Cicero made an attempt to undermine his opponent by asserting that Antony had received a stola, a customary garment worn by married women, from a different man. Regarding the subject of Rome being a patriarchal culture, it should be noted that despite existing for almost 1,200 years, societal prejudices about women and the duties that belong to the female sex were prevalent in both the legal systems of ancient Rome and colonial America. Women have always been subject to restrictive rules that control the social and political domains of society. Women's legal and social rights were severely restricted in Rome, particularly under the patria potestas and ideas of womanly frailty in terms of mental and physical aptitude. This was especially true throughout the Roman imperial period, which lasted from around 30 BCE to the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476 CE. Women's rights were restricted in colonial American culture, especially from 1639 and 1789, due to patriarchal expectations around a woman's natural duty as a devout homemaker. Misogyny is a commonality between Roman and colonial American gender legislation. The former is rooted in the patria potestas, while the latter is rooted in European patriarchal society. There was comparable societal and legal discrimination based on gender in colonial America and Roman antiquity. Another topic that is widely discussed is how Romans view being a woman as a weakness. Roman law and culture were dominated by the ideas of the paterfamilias, or the male head of the home, and the patria potestas, or the authority of the father over his offspring, throughout the history of Rome. Because Roman fathers had unmatched authority over their sons, the patria potestas were so powerful that Gaius in his Institutes claimed that they had a unique function in Roman society. Gaius specifically mentioned authority over sons, but the patria potestas had significant legal implications that discriminated against women in Roman culture from approximately 450 BCE. For example, this masculine dominance required that if a woman's husband died before her, she could not take on the role of a conservator for their kid. The giving of such authority to Roman women over their offspring would too closely resemble the masculine authority reserved for Roman males, according to this legal reality. Furthermore, it was clearly stated in the Code of Justinian that administering a guardianship is a man's burden, and such a duty is beyond the sex of feminine weakness. Furthermore, women were prohibited from officially adopting children until the 3rd century CE, and even then, only with special authorization, as doing so would have placed the adopted kid under the adopter's authority, which was something that women were not permitted to have. Roman women faced overt discrimination based on their gender when it came to adopting and rearing children, since it is evident from Roman legislation that the female sex was considered too intellectually weak compared to Roman men, and so unable to administer guardianships. In Roman courts, women were viewed as incapable of being mentally and physically independent from males. It was against the law for women to appear in court on behalf of another person in ancient Rome. Ancient Roman jurists recognized that standing up for someone else in court was a duty bestowed upon men and much beyond the qualifications of a woman. Women are therefore disadvantaged in both the legal and social spheres by the patria potestas, which restrict a woman's capacity to act legally due to accusations of feminine weakness. Since a woman's accomplishment in this endeavor would contradict the Roman philosophy underlying the paterfamilias, it is possible to interpret such legal discrimination based on sex as a Roman strategy for preserving the paterfamilias. Roman law also reflected the view that women were inferior to males both intellectually and physically. In the course of the 4th century, several laws were passed mandating varying penalties based on a person's sex. Roman law heavily emphasized the distinctions between social classes, namely between slaves and free people, and between Roman citizens and foreigners. The fact that rules pertaining to sex are punished similarly to laws involving status, given the significance of position in Roman society, highlights the weight and permanence of gender inequality, stemming from ideas of womanly frailty in both the intellect and body. There is also gender inequality when it comes to the union of marriage. Manus in Roman marriage was seen as the conjugal counterpart of patria potestas, in which the Roman woman was fully subservient to her husband's legal authority. Such a convention not only reflects the pervasive sexism of Roman culture, but also the social and legal restrictions that Roman marriage imposed on women. For example, the majority of ancient Roman marriage laws prohibited partnerships based on status, including social standing and condition of freedom. The significance of social position was highly valued in Roman culture, and marriage and marital law were no exception. Therefore, although they were not punished, marriages between liberated people and slaves or non-citizens were not regarded as legitimate ones and were strongly discouraged. Furthermore, it was seen negatively by society and the economy when freed women married slave men, but not when they married slave women, which was stigmatized. This most likely resulted from Roman ideas about gender and appropriate social hierarchy, which held that women should always be seen as less socially significant than their husbands. Furthermore, since a mother's position determined a society's standing, the children of such a relationship would likely be born free and would therefore be viewed by the Romans as a reduction in the supply of slaves. A discriminatory effect was thus seen toward Roman women, particularly those of senatorial status, as a result of both social and economic gendered conceptions, which further condemned and viewed as more troubling the non-legal unions between freed women and slave men than those between freedmen and slave women. Moving on, there is also another factor that played a big part in how ancient Romans view homosexuality, specifically how their gods influenced their views about the matter. Gender-bending gods, Roman deities were mirror images of the social mores and cultural norms of the world of men, just like those of other ancient nations. Roman mythology does contain stories of gods and mortal men having same-sex partnerships, much like their Greek contemporaries. For a very long time, male-to-male lust was linked to the Roman Cupid, who was frequently revered as the patron saint of intense love between two men. Some ladies revered Venus as the goddess of female-to-female love. According to tradition, the virgin goddess Diana enjoyed the company of women. She and her companions danced, went hunting in the woods, and vowed to never again see men. In a myth, the goddess Jupiter pretended to be the princess Callisto and wooed Diana while she was hidden. Britomachus was a nymph who jumped into the water to escape King Minos's pursuit. After saving Britomachus from the water, Diana developed feelings for her. As you see, these gods did not really stick to their gender roles and pursued the same sex without hesitation. However, it is intriguing to consider why it would be that gods, demigods, heroes, and other legendary creatures having both male and female qualities can be found in various civilizations. The deity, Shasta, also known as Ayappa, was born as a result of Shiva being seduced by Mohini, the feminine form of Vishnu in Hindu mythology. Shiva is frequently depicted as Ardhanarishvara, an androgynous combination of Shiva and Parvati, whose left side of the body is female and his right side is masculine. Arjuna, the legendary warrior from the Mahabharata epic, essentially a Hindu version of Achilles, assumed the alias Brihanala and taught the princess Uttara how to sing and dance for a year. Talking about Achilles, his mother, the goddess Thetis, sent him to reside at the court of the king of Skyros, where he assumed the guises of a daughter named Pyrrha, Issa, or Kirkisera, in order to save him from dying at Troy, as had been predicted. To save his weapon, Mjolnir, without which the Asgardian gods would have been subjugated by the giants. Even the Germanic thunder god Thor had to journey to the country of the giants disguised as a bride. But there are more than just gender-bending gods. Roman satirist Lucian recounts a conversation between two courtesans in which one of the ladies constantly refers to her partner as being terribly like a man. She talks of their blossoming affection and suggests that, as many individuals are believed to be, her lover may be qualified to be both a man and a woman. She states that, although her partner was born a woman, he had a man's passions, thoughts, and body in every other way. Modern ideas of biology, identity, and orientation appear to be confused by the way sex, gender, and sexuality interact in Lucian's narrative. Many experiences that may be viewed as transcending sex and gender norms were present in ancient Rome. However, the marginalization and sensationalization of transfeminine identities, manifestations, and non-binary sex assignments were fostered by a male-dominated Roman culture. These gender dynamics generated displays of power in politics and religion, as well as limiting romantic and sexual experiences. The Roman poet Ovid's account of the story of Iphis and Ianthe aptly illustrates the ambiguity surrounding female same-sex eroticism in ancient Rome. Although Iphis is a girl at birth, her mother raises her as a boy since her father desires a son. After that, Iphis's parents set up her marriage to Ianthe, and the two of them fall in love. The mother of Iphis begs the goddess Isis for healing. her wishes are heard, and Iphis grows into a handsome young man. This sibling incest scenario works well as a juxtaposition of biological and sociocultural interpretations of sexual morality. Despite the biological validity of the siblings' heterosexuality, society disapproves of their love. As for Iphis and Ianthe, their love is just incompatible from a biological standpoint. Thus, heavenly intervention, rather than a violation of Roman social mores, is responsible for the couple's happy conclusion. Unlike the legitimacy and social boost that comes with masculinization or female-to-male transsexuality, sexual passivity and feminine presentation have historically been associated with stigma. For example, the renowned historian Edward Gibbon told of how the Roman emperor Elagabalus let herself be seduced by the vilest of pleasures and pretended to mimic the attire and social mores of the female sex. Elagabalus reportedly identified as a woman in addition to depilating and applying makeup. She apparently called herself a lady, queen, wife, and mistress, and she asked her doctors to fit her with female genitalia. Despite his own outmoded social mores, Gibbon acknowledged that, as a man writing in the late 18th century, reports of Elagabalus' vices and follies might have been tainted by prejudice, leading political rivals to avenge their master by creating a false impression of a feminized and deviant tyrant. The feminine manifestations of several Roman emperors were demonized, and their promiscuous conduct was frequently seen as sinful. It's possible that these gay identities and acts were purposefully designed to convey to Roman audiences the emperor's superior status and authority. According to legend, between battles and trips to the amphitheater, Emperor Commodus colored his hair, dusted it with gold dust, and assumed the form of a lady. It was also reported that he proudly engraved the term effeminatus on his Colossus restoration. Similarly, a statue of Marcus Aurelius was altered to have a female form. It's possible that such gender-bending imagery and the rejection of gendered bodily conceptions revealed a devotion to or similarity to the gods. The state religion of Rome did, in fact, incorporate the rituals of the eunuch priests of the goddess Cybele. As part of their initiation rite, a novice had to remove his masculine clothing, castrate himself with a sword, and then race around the town brandishing his genitalia. He had to throw them into a randomly selected house, where the occupants had to outfit him in feminine clothing. By transgressing sex and gender conventions, this violent practice expressed religious devotion, relationship between men and women. As previously stated, the way that homosexuality was viewed and presented in Roman society differed greatly from how it is today, and it serves as an illustration of how, even in antiquity, homosexuality was inextricably related to messages of authority and power. Latin lacks a term for heterosexuality or homosexuality. Therefore, regardless of the genders of the parties involved, partners in a sexual connection are portrayed as either aggressive, which is linked with masculinity, or passive, which is feminine. Men's sexual connections spanned all social groups, and during the Roman Empire, there were several accounts of Roman emperors having sex. The most well-known of these relationships is that of Emperor Hadrian and the Greek teenager Antinous. It was considered scandalous and degrading for men to be the passive partners in a sexual relationship, since penetrative intercourse between men was mysteriously associated with the active man's authority and prowess. In short, sex served as a tool for the exercise of privilege and domination, and homosexuality in ancient Rome was more about signals of power and rank than it was about attraction and feeling. A Roman citizen's civic liberties enabled him to have these kinds of relationships with any guy who was lower in society than him, all the while displaying his virility and dominance over others. Roman males were even known to orally rape their opponents as a way to demonstrate their dominance over them and to make fun of the victim. Despite the fact that laws were put in place to both prosecute the perpetrator and safeguard the victim's status, this practice transfers so directly to demonstrations of power. On the other hand, the literature on same-sex relationships among Roman women is scant. The Romans didn't write about them, despite the fact that they most likely occurred, as they believed that sex entailed penetration. Unlike the penetrating behaviors between two males, it's possible that the Romans did not consider sexual practices between women to constitute sex. It's also interesting to note that some accounts of Roman women mention romance rather than sexual activity. In her book Love Between Women, Bernadette Bruton describes how women might hire spells to entice other women. According to academics, these spells offer documented proof that women in that era were open to love relationships with other women and were at ease expressing their wants. According to Bruton, the spells do not reveal the internal dynamics of these women's relationships. Nevertheless, the spells do raise intriguing, although ultimately unanswerable, questions about the nature of women's erotic desires. In addition, there is the peculiar element of women in Rome who show themselves as masculine. Scholars have the opinion that, in contrast to the age-based division found in male same-sex couples, female relationships in ancient Rome were characterized by one woman being the more feminine partner and the other the more masculine. Stigma and punishment. While there are a lot of records saying that homosexuality was vastly accepted during ancient Rome, it doesn't mean people were allowed to love one another freely and openly without the possibility of getting punished. The punishment is so severe, one would wonder if being gay during ancient Rome was even acceptable. At one point, those who are caught in a homosexual relationship are burned to death. Specifically, by the end of the 4th century, the Christian Empire punished men who took the passive role in a relationship between two males. But it doesn't stop there, because the restrictions when it comes to anything related to homosexuality took a drastic turn as time passed. For instance, death by the sword was the punishment for a man coupling like a woman under the Theodosian Code. The code was a compendium of Roman law commissioned by Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, and it was meant to compress and organize the complex corpus of imperial laws established during Emperor Constantine's rule in 312 CE. On the other hand, Justinian's legal and moral discourse on male-male sex became unmistakably Abrahamic. Based on this, all male-male intercourse, passive or active, regardless of who the parties were, was proclaimed against nature and punishable by death. And just like that, after a series of tragedies between 542 and 559, male-male intercourse was cited as the source of God's anger. Homosexual leaders of ancient Rome. Despite the stigma and punishment, ancient Rome had a handful of homosexual rulers who led the empire throughout the ages. And while some of them didn't have a happy ending, it's undeniable that there were a few emperors who left a positive impact on their people. First, we have Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, who transformed a Mediterranean republic into a lasting empire, was engulfed in homosexual controversy and gossip that followed him throughout his life, until his execution in 44 BCE. Most current academics dismiss the suggestion that Caesar was in a relationship with and was the bottom of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, a once independent kingdom spanning along the northern coast of modern Turkey that became a Roman client state and subsequently part of the empire. Around 80 BCE, Caesar, a junior officer on Praetor Marcus Minucius Thermus's staff, was sent to ask Nicomedes IV for military help. According to historian Suetonius, Caesar spent so much time in the Bithynian court, successfully obtaining military help from the Bithynian monarch, that rumors circulated about Caesar bottoming for the king. Roman traders and merchants were believed to have seen the 20-year-old Caesar lounging around with Nicomedes in his palace, and Caesar was allegedly spotted entering the king's bedroom. The accusation of being a bottom was regularly leveled at young Roman males. Being a pretty boy Jason was an insult intended to stab up-and-coming Romans and tarnish their reputation with a cloud of scandal. To say Caesar had many adversaries is an understatement. But can there be smoke without fire? Although there is no hard evidence that Caesar had a homosexual relationship, we do know what contemporary Romans felt about the accusation. Cicero, one of Caesar's harshest adversaries in the Senate, discounted the Republic's gains from Nicomedes, stating, "We all know what he gave you and what you gave him in return." Caesar denied the accusations under oath, but the rumors were repeated not only by Cicero, but also by other prominent Romans of the late Republic, such as poet Licinius Calvus, senator and consul Gaius Memmius, and another of Caesar's allies turned enemies, Marcus Bibulus. Suetonius also reports that after Caesar's death, ally Mark Antony accused his adopted son Octavian of sleeping with Caesar to become his heir, although it's questionable whether or not Suetonius himself took the oath. If you think the rumors about Caesar are bad enough, wait until you hear what happened to Emperor Trajan and Hadrian. Both these names are always brought up whenever talks about homosexuality in ancient Rome is the topic. After being adopted by Trajan, Hadrian would ascend to the throne. Hadrian and Trajan were homosexual. The only issue was that both Trajan and Hadrian were homosexual. At least that's what most books would suggest. It turns out that Trajan and Hadrian frequently fight over a harem of attractive teenage males at court. Clearly, the imbalance between a pubescent young boy and Rome's most powerful emperor is unimaginable, and it would be incorrect to regard Trajan as having anything resembling a homosexual relationship. But Trajan's behavior was predatory, despite Cassius Dio's claim that he was devoted to both boys and wine. Despite this, he remained sober and did not harm anyone in his relationship with boys. Abgar VII was the king of Edessa, a minor autonomous kingdom located between Rome and its formidable foe Parthia. Abgar and Trajan's relations had gone sour, so Abgar sent his son Arbandes, handsome and in the prime of youth and therefore in favor of Trajan. According to Cassius Dio, the son was sent to perform some barbaric dance or other for Trajan at a feast. And by the looks of it, the plan was a success after it was revealed that Trajan was pleased with the kid, particularly his gold earrings. The move worked for a while. However, toward the conclusion of Trajan's reign, Abgar joined the Parthians in a revolt. Edessa was demolished and Abgar was slain. Hadrian then nominated Abgar's brother Manu VII as a client king, and Edessa was formally absorbed as a Roman province in 212 CE. Moving on, Hadrian also wrote his own story about a particularly handsome man named Antinous. In fact, the affair between Emperor Hadrian and his Greek friend Antinous is possibly the most well-known and tragic relationship to have influenced the final major creative era of classical art, as well as following artists for over 2 millennia. Antinous' background is not entirely understood. Historical documents contain no significant facts about his background, making it impossible to determine his origins or social rank. There was much speculation about his past, which ranged from slave to potential royal or perhaps Hadrian's illegitimate son. Given his probable beginnings, Antinous was unlikely to belong to the higher ranks of society. While such notions may be appealing, they lack a strong historical basis. One of the most widely held hypotheses concerning his beginnings is that he was a slave. While this theory appears rational, there are indicators that it was most likely false. It is reported that Bithynia had a low slave population during the time. Also, the presence of an obelisk on Rome's Pincian Hill that commemorates his family suggests that Antinous was not a slave, as it would have been disgraceful for Hadrian to praise or deify a slave. It is unclear how Antinous first met Hadrian, although there are strong indications that it occurred in 123 CE during Hadrian's tour of the provinces. As part of the journey, the emperor went to Bithynia's capital, Nicomedia, which had been hit by an earthquake about 120 to 122 CE. Hadrian went to the city to oversee the repair operations. He most likely first encountered Antinous there. The youngster was 11 to 13 years old. Another hypothesis is that they met at Claudiopolis, where Antinous resided in 123 CE. Given Hadrian's journey to Bithynia, it is likely that he met Antinous during a public celebration of the emperor's visit or another public occasion. It's probable that Hadrian saw the child and chose him for his entourage. However, throughout Hadrian's early years, Antinous did not accompany him on his journeys. The youngster was transferred to the Pedagogium, a boarding school in Rome, where he attended for at least many years. The Pedagogium was a school that trained young men for employment in the imperial palace or the personal service of high-ranking officials. Little is known about their connection. It may seem unexpected given how intimately Antinous's narrative is related to Hadrian, yet only a few aspects regarding their connection have been established. He married Trajan's grandniece, Vibia Sabina, in a stressful and unpleasant relationship. Hadrian appears to have preferred males as sexual and loving companions, with Antinous being his most well-known preference. Historians today agree that their connection included a sexual component, which was widely known in Roman times. Antinous was not Hadrian's first male partner, and such a relationship was considered socially acceptable at the time. Hadrian accompanied Antinous on his many journeys. Antinous was most likely with the emperor when Hadrian contracted a mysterious sickness in 127 CE. While the etiology of this ailment is unknown, we do know that it did not keep the emperor from traveling. Antinous accompanied him on his journey from Rome to Athens, where the emperor and possibly Antinous were initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. Following this, Hadrian proceeded through Asia Minor until arriving in Egypt in 130 CE. Antinous followed him on all of his excursions. The young man died on his tour to Egypt. Hadrian and Antinous landed in Egypt in August, 130 CE. They visited Alexander the Great's tomb before traveling to Libya. In Libya, they went out to kill a lion that was scaring the locals. They were able to track down the lion. It is reported that during the struggle, the lion charged at Antinous, and Hadrian saved his lover's life. The monarch honored this occasion by commissioning artists and poets to describe the lion's death. Hadrian's company then embarked on a journey down the Nile River. They landed in Heliopolis, where the emperor conferred with priest Pancrates about his condition, presumably in search of a cure or a spell to erase it. In October 130 CE, Hadrian and his company celebrated the festival of Osiris. This is where Antinous met his death. The circumstances surrounding his demise were unknown in his day. It is commonly acknowledged that he drowned in the Nile, although the circumstances surrounding this have never been confirmed. His body was discovered floating in the river, although it was never completely revealed what caused the tragedy. Hadrian himself briefly stated that Antinous's death was an accident. However, some publications suggest a different interpretation. Cassius Dio, a historian, states that Antinous was given as a human sacrifice to cure the emperor. Another plausible theory is that Antinous committed suicide or intentionally sacrificed himself for Hadrian's health. Another story holds that Antinous was slain as a consequence of court intrigue. However, there is no clear evidence supporting this. The most fascinating of the ideas is a possible human sacrifice, which adds to the mystery surrounding the young man's death. It is said that Hadrian was grieved by the loss. Shortly after Antinous died, the emperor deified him and established a cult in his honor. This was the beginning of Antinous's legacy and his mythology's creation. Lastly, we have Theodosius, the last of the gays who shattered the Roman Empire and spawned the subsequent medieval wars between church and monarchs, was sparked by a charioteer, a municipal governor, and the attractive young cupbearer they both adored. We don't know the cupbearer's name, but we do know he was a handsome young man who resided in the Greek city of Salonika around 390 CE. At this moment, the empire was experiencing a religious shift. The previous emperor, Julian the Apostate, attempted but failed to extinguish Christianity, and the next emperor, Theodosius I, was essential in establishing the empire on a solid Christian foundation. In reality, Theodosius was the last emperor to rule a unified Rome. Following his reign, the division between East and West, Constantinople and Rome, became permanent. The West was about to enter its last century. Theodosius is particularly remembered for defeating the Goths, a Germanic force that was constantly advancing into the empire. But despite winning significant wars against these tribes, Theodosius concluded that the Goths could never truly be expelled from the domain of the Romans. Instead, he reached a deal with them, allowing them to inhabit portions of Roman territory south of the Danube in exchange for military service. Given that the Goths were already established in the empire, the contract was more pragmatic than theological. The Goths were permitted to remain autonomous under their own commanders, fighting as an independent ally rather than being absorbed into the Roman army. The next day, as the throng gathered at the Hippodrome to see their favorite celebrity and collect his autograph, it was revealed that he was actually in prison, having been brought there by Butteric, and they were outraged. They formed a crowd and assaulted the jail, releasing the charioteer and killing Butteric and his Gothic guards. When Emperor Theodosius learned about the uproar, he attempted to appease the Saloniki populace by promising additional sports, including the charioteer. The audience, pleased with the rearranged date, returned to the Hippodrome to cheer on their idol. All 7,000 of them. Families and children gathered to see the most Roman of pleasures. But then Theodosius had his retribution, because his forces sealed the Hippodrome's gates and slaughtered all 7,000 people who had gathered there. It barely took them 3 hours to cut them all to death in retaliation for the city's murder of Butteric and the Goths. the great bulk of Saloniki's non-Christian inhabitants were massacred in what is known as the Massacre of Thessalonica. Christians unexpectedly gained the majority in the city, a clear omen for the remainder of the rest of empire from its fervent Christian monarch. Introduction of Christianity in ancient Rome. It's undeniable that the introduction of Christianity in ancient Rome created a lot of changes. Specifically, stricter laws were implemented when it comes to homosexual relationships. But it's important to point out that prior to Christianity, major civilizations followed primarily polytheistic religions in ancient Rome. Polytheistic faiths have several deities or gods. In ancient Greece, for example, there was Zeus, the monarch deity of the earth and heavens, Poseidon, god of the sea, Hades, god of the underworld, Athena, goddess of wisdom, Aphrodite, goddess of love, and so on. Monotheistic religions, on the other hand, hold that there is only one God, and records would show that before Christianity, the empire pretty much tolerated anything that involved homosexuality. In fact, pre-Christian Roman literature, such as Clitophon and Leucippe, depicts homosexual and heterosexual romantic love as indistinguishable, with gender treated as an accident. The literature on gay partnerships and its treatment of sexual orientation imply that same-sex relationships were frequent. Both pieces of evidence show a culture accepting of diverse sexual expressions, including gay partnerships. The written legislation provides clear proof of the early Roman Empire's tolerance for homosexuality. During the early empire, same-sex unions were legal and institutionalized. Long-term different-sex marriages were also becoming increasingly prevalent, but things took a drastic turn after Christianity was introduced in the empire. Christianity is a monotheistic religion with a transcendent God, akin to the Hebrew god Yahweh. Unlike the polytheistic, sexually charged cosmos of ancient Roman religion, the Christian God does not reproduce or engage in sexual relations. It was revealed that Christianity's rise in the Roman Empire was a long-term trend, highlighted by Emperor Constantine III's conversion and the establishment of Christianity as the official religion in the empire. As expected, as Christianity spread, the Roman Empire became less accepting of homosexuality and other sexual manifestations compared to prior times. The early Christian philosophers and the late Roman Empire's written laws both reflected an increase in intolerance. Early Christian attitudes about sexuality were also heavily affected by the intellectual tradition of dualism, which posits a conflict between good and evil forces for control of a soul. Historically, Christian moral rules have been connected with anti-homosexual sentiment and intolerance towards sexual expression. While others claim that early Christian theologians like Augustine did not reflect public sentiment, the legislation demonstrates negative sentiments towards homosexuality under the monotheistic Roman Empire. In summary, Christian monarchs issued all Roman anti-homosexual laws from the 4th century onward. In 342 AD, the Roman Empire approved a statute stating that same-sex marriages would result in exquisite punishment. Following the fall of the Roman Empire, sentiments against same-sex partnerships became increasingly hostile. According to Eskridge, in the surviving Eastern Empire, the Justinian Code of 533 AD, outlawing same-sex intimacy, along with divorce and adultery, undermined the Christian ideal of companionate different-sex marriages. These statutes clearly express modern attitudes regarding homosexuality. Roman emperors opposed homosexuality using Christian rhetoric and religious terminology in their legislation. The legislative regulations enacted during Christianity's early period of rapid expansion contributed to the formation of hostile views towards homosexual Christian principles. Furthermore, this antagonism was directed not only against homosexuals, but also against other types of sexual behavior, including concubinage, masturbation, and adultery. By this time, same-sex relationships and sexual expressions that were formerly acceptable to the Romans had become prohibited. The contrast between the pre-Christian and Christian Roman empires highlights significant variations in views towards sexuality. During the pre-Christian Roman Empire, gay relationships and sexual manifestations were widely accepted. However, as Christianity spread, there was a growing prejudice against homosexuality. Modern Italy. When discussing Italian history and homosexuality, people frequently mention the rainbow trinity of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Caravaggio. Knowing that 3 of history's most famous artists shared my sexuality brings me some comfort. especially given recent developments in my native country. After years of bitter debate and several failures, Italy ultimately recognized same-sex civil partnerships in 2016. Although the government gives same-sex couples the majority of the privileges provided to married straight couples, we still do not have access to marriage because, as right-wing politicians and conservative Catholics like to remind us, marriage is solely that between a man and a woman. What about last year, when the Senate blocked a measure to combat homophobia? The DDL-Zan law aimed to criminalize hate crimes based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. Senators who voted against it hailed the news in Parliament, exulting and clapping as if their favorite football club had just won the Champions League. In fact, of the nearly 2,500 Italian professional players, I am not aware of anyone who has come out of the closet. Not a single one. However, Italy has a long history of homosexuality that extends beyond famous artists to include ordinary people. It's a history traceable back to the few papers deemed worthy of preservation. Court records, trials, and convictions, mostly involving males, which demonstrate the presence of communities and, in some cases, entire subcultures in several Italian towns since the 15th century. Way before then, in the 6th century BC, the Etruscans left murals in Tarquinia, Lazio portraying males indulging in anal intercourse, and the ancient Greeks had brought their same-sex relations, a type of civil education for young men, to their South Italian colonies. Ancient Rome's social elite, mostly influenced by Greek models, also maintained a somewhat tolerant attitude regarding same-sex meetings, which were practically universal among the upper class, including emperors. The stars aligned with Nero, who reputedly married two of his freedmen, and Trajan, who was known for his affection for boys. We all know about Hadrian and Antinous from Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian, which, by romanticizing the coupling, may have warped our understanding of homosexuality in ancient times. Homosexual partnerships as we know them today, between two free adults, were rarely permitted. Patriarchy was popular across the empire, and Roman men, who were preoccupied with their virility then and now, could only have intercourse with other men if they played the penetrative role. Male prostitution was widely practiced, controlled, and taxed to generate a profit for the empire. By the later Roman Empire, a rigid view of sexuality for the lowest classes had taken hold. Morality had shifted toward a strong condemnation of homosexuality, which found an ideal fit in the emerging Christian ethics. Graffiti in Pompeii reflects the ordinary passerby's homophobia, with some extra color. One may still read, "Secundus sucks it," "Ismenus cocksucker," "Narcissus is the greatest cocksucker," and the harshest insult possible, "broken ass." Who knew that, along with numbers and aqueducts, the ancient Romans created bottom shaming? In the 4th century AD, we moved from partying like it was BC to legislation prescribing death as a penalty for same-sex encounters. The jurisdiction was handed on to the Byzantines, and it lasted into the Middle Ages. Unlike Northern European countries where the death sentence was carried out by hanging or drowning, in Italy, the most popular punishment for sodomites, and in certain cases, lesbians, was death by burning at the stake. We Italians have always had a taste for theatrics. Between the 14th and 16th centuries, Italy had a privileged place in European history, with thriving economies, societies, and arts. During the almost 2 centuries of the Italian Renaissance, there was a renewed interest in ancient culture and a rediscovery of forgotten writers, and important thinkers such as Marsilio Ficino revived Plato's notion of love. Plato, a hopeless misogynist, considered the ideal partnership as one between two men who could transcend sexual desire to achieve wisdom and truth. The City of Lilies was at the heart of this movement, ensuring an exceptional level of tolerance for gays. The San Francisco of the Renaissance may not have had the Folsom Street Fair, but folks knew how to have a good time. While other towns penalized hundreds of people, Florence took a more permissive approach, to the point that the situation appeared entirely out of control to religious moralists at the time. Priest Bernardino of Siena chastised our overly libertine forebears, declaring in one of his sermons that there are no people in the world more sodomite than Italians. Almost 2 centuries later, a Scottish tourist wrote of Padua, noting that, for beastly sodomy, it is rife here as in Rome, Naples, Florence, Bologna, Venice, Ferrara, Genoa, Parma. not being exempted, nor yet the smallest village of Italy. Sodomy was a felony far into the 18th century when Napoleon's Grande Armée conquered half of Europe and extended post-revolutionary French laws to Italy. Same-sex sexual behavior, for both men and women, became lawful in 1890 when the new criminal code of the unified country was enacted. During the late 19th and early 20th century, Italy became a shelter for homosexuals from Northern Europe and the United States, thanks in part to this new legal structure. Southern Italy, known for the perceived willingness of its male population, who were in fact in severe need of money, grew in popularity, particularly Capri and Taormina. It is cruel that years later, fascism would punish gays by confining them on adjacent islands, sometimes terribly impoverished and in the middle of nowhere. Post-war Italy, politically dominated by the Catholic Party, did nothing to combat the widespread homophobia of the time. Society cared about gay people for the wrong reasons, as demonstrated in 1960, when an inquiry into the homosexual scene in the northern town of Brescia devolved into a gigantic media circus with numerous plot twists and baseless allegations. When the so-called Scandalo dei Balletti Verdi, or Green Ballet scandal, reached TV personalities like Mike Bongiorno, the entire country got morbidly interested in it. In 1971, Fuori, Italy's first homosexual group, was created. Mario Mieli, the most well-known Italian LGBTQ+ activist, participated in the movement before forming his own group. A year later, a group of LGBT individuals publicly protested for their rights for the first time in the country's history. Since then, the Italian queer community has maintained an active role in expressing and demanding rights. Italy is gradually improving its stance toward LGBTQ+ persons, but at a far slower rate than the majority of European countries. Queer individuals are more acceptable, as long as they stay away from the Italian government and football pitches. Undeniably, ancient Rome can be compared to a tragic yet beautiful story. Tragic in the sense that people were once punished for loving a person. However, we can't deny that such stories left a mark in history, spread through timeless literature and writings about people who were brave enough to fight for their love. While modern Italy has a long way to go, the progress and evolution the country underwent is worth mentioning, and hopefully, these stories can also make you think and reflect. How about you? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Also, make sure to give a like and subscribe for more stories from history.